Welcome everyone. My name is Bill Fanning. I'm a member of the Talk team. Really excited for our conversation today. It is about neurodiversity in the hiring process and in the workplace, and it's something that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to discuss it. Before I jump into that, just a couple quick things. We have some great speakers coming up, and I just wanted to make you aware of it. We have Ben Eubanks speaking next week. He's from Lighthouse Advisors, and he's going to share a bunch of 2024 data. He's phenomenal, and they are great at assessing the talent acquisition marketplace and what's going on there. And then we have Chad and Cheese from the podcast coming to speak on Wednesday, October 7th, because they could not do Thursday. And then we have Steve Rothberg coming to talk about diversity and campus recruiting and recruiting newer people and what's important to them. So those are the next few webinars coming up. And then we have some great events that we're going to be at. We're going to be at RecFest in September. It's the 12th and 13th. It's in Nashville. We're going to be attending HR Tech in September. It's the 24th to 26th, and that's in Las Vegas. That's at the Mandalay Bay. And then the next one we have after that actually rolls into 2025, and it is the Transform Conference. It will be at the Wynn in Las Vegas, and that's March 17th to the 19th. And finally, just two simple asks. If you guys think of anything, you could communicate it via email or chat. If there's any topics that you would like us to engage in or talk about during these weekly discussion forums, I'm definitely open. I'm very capable of finding topics, but I want to make sure that we're addressing or talking about things that are relevant to all of us as members, and that we're delivering good things. And the other thing that I wanted to ask is we're going to be launching very softly next week our vendor marketplace and adding in some new vendors and building out the pages. And so my ask there, if there's any vendor that has been exceptionally helpful to your talent acquisition process, and you think other people would benefit, any other members would benefit from learning more about it, then I'd love to know who they are so we can reach out and introduce ourselves to them and see if they'd like to come in. Because if they're helping you, they could probably help a lot of other people in the process. So, so that's really the only housekeeping things. We're talking today about neurodiversity, and I put a little definition together myself. I don't know if that's on point or not. Julie can beat it up later, but it in kind of the 6 things that I think it helps with, which is diversity, innovation and creativity, improving company culture. Obviously, if you have a great onboarding and accepting policy for people with neurodiversity, it's awesome. And the output is a competitive advantage. The compliance piece, I'm not super excited about, but it is part of how, especially OFCCP and other companies, other government agencies look at companies that are, for example, doing business with the federal government. And the other side story and why I chose this topic is a little bit personal. So I have 4 children, and neurodiversity is part of our daily existence. Which is wonderful. I love it. But I had a conversation recently with someone who was talking to my daughter and was struggling with the fact that she doesn't like to make eye contact when she has a serious conversation. And she needs to look down at her hands and fiddle. And so after I spoke to this person, they totally got it. But then it started making me, I came back and sat down in my chair at work, and it started making me think, what if that was an interview? What if she was interviewing for a job? How would a hiring manager understand that by doing what she's doing, she's very engaged. She's actually listening to you. And so that made me start to think about, how do we address this? This is something that, I address a couple different ways in my life, but as a hiring manager or as a recruiting team, this is important. And it's, I think, being more widely accepted. And so it's going to be a continually necessary part of thinking through our talent acquisition process and bringing people on board and making them feel welcomed and supporting their individual and unique needs, because that makes us a better company and a stronger, innovative culture. It fosters a culture that I would want to be a part of. So I reached out to somebody in my network that I know that I think is an amazing resource and source of knowledge in this area. And so I wanted to introduce her. Her name is Julie Sowash. She is the Executive Director of Disability Solutions. And she's been in this area and talking about these issues and educating and sharing her information about it with a lot of people, which I think is amazing. And so I wanted to turn this over to her. She can talk a little bit about how my definition of neurodiversity is not correct, and then share what is the right diverse the definition, but share with us and have a conversation that I hope you'll all engage in to, as a collective group, learn more about this. And on a side note, if you can turn your camera on, that's awesome, because I love the sense of community, being able to see everybody and put faces and names together. If you can't, for whatever reason, I completely understand, but if you could, that'd be awesome. And really excited you're all here. So with that, I'm going to let Julie kind of introduce herself. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can just focus on everybody who's in the discussion. And I'm excited for today's session. So thank you. So Julie, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill, for having me. Thank you all for taking a little time out of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're coming from in the world, to talk about the disability community, and in this case, the neurodiverse community. So I guess I'll start a little bit about me and a little bit about my story. And then before we kick off to open discussion, I want to share my favorite neurodiversity hiring story that I got to be a part of. So as Bill said, I am the Executive Director of Disability Solutions. I'm also one of the co-founders. We have been working with companies for about 13 years. I was lucky enough for the first 7 or so to cut my teeth with one of the best companies in the world, PepsiCo, to really figure out how do we get people with disabilities to work. And why I was perfect, I brag on myself not very often, but in this case I will. Perfect for that job is because I am neurodiverse. And so I didn't always know that I was neurodiverse. And Bill did get the definition correct. And I always love sharing a little carrot and a little stick. Compliance is important. It's not sexy, but it keeps us moving along. But for me personally, about 15 years ago, I was managing a federal grant for the state of Indiana called the Medicaid Infrastructure Grant. And really what we did was work on overcoming barriers to employment for people with disabilities in the state of Indiana. And as a part of that, I got the opportunity to write a 5-year strategic plan to start overcoming some of those barriers. And through that work, I got really connected with several different compliance organizations and became very familiar with that work, and started to see not just the importance of compliance, but also understanding that it wasn't really government or charity or philanthropy that was going to change the world for my community. It really was and is business leaders like all of you sitting on this call today. And if I can change one of your minds about what my community can bring to the table, then you and I can have a ripple effect that will change the lives of numerous people because you understand our value. And so while I was working on this, I was really in a period of instability in my own life. And I've suffered with depression, anxiety, panic attacks since about the age of 20. Panic 21, when I became a mom, that really kicked in. And I come from a place in the world where we don't talk about those things. We pick ourselves up by our bootstraps. We pray a little bit harder. We ask Jesus for some more patience or whatever it is that we needed. And I wasn't taught that actually what I needed was to talk to a doctor about what was happening in my brain and in my body. And I was really, really lucky because I was working in a world where my leadership understood what disability looked like. And they understood that even though I showed up every single day, I worked 8 to 5 and oftentimes well into the evening because I was having panic attacks every single day in the office and hiding in the bathroom, that I was valuable enough to them to say, she's not just a good worker, but she's someone we can have a conversation with, because this isn't what stable looks like. And they said that to me, Julie, this isn't what stable looks like. We don't know what's going on, but you need to go and you need to talk to your doctors and you need to figure out what's going on. And it was then, I was just about the age of 30, where I got my ADHD diagnosis. And when I got medication and cognitive therapy for that disability, the world suddenly changed. My blood pressure went down 20 points. I started sleeping at night. Panic attacks stopped, or at least became manageable for a long time until now they're almost non-existent. And I wouldn't be in this position doing the work that I get to do if I hadn't had a really great leader who cared enough and invested enough in me to see me as more than just a cog in their wheel, but to say, there is more to life than what you're living right now. That really not just changed the world for me, it changed it for my kids, but it also has changed the world for the 10,000 plus people leaders that we've trained now and the 8,000 people that we know have gotten to work with disabilities through the companies that we work with at Disability Solutions. And, that's really always how I want to open up a conversation, is with just a challenge that you guys understand that the work that you do is incredibly important. And when you take the time to think about people, whether it's in your processes or your management style or the culture that you build, you can have a dramatic impact that's going to be much bigger than what you can see in your life. And so the other story that I want to tell is probably my favorite I got someone to work story. I don't always get to experience this because a lot of what we do is at a technology level and not necessarily at a person level, at least not for me. But in 2018, we were opening a hiring program for a call center in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And there was a young man, 18 years old, high functioning autism, but very definitely autistic. Some of the things that Bill talked through that he goes through with his daughter were very similar. And this young man, when we met him, he had two goals. One was to get out of his parents' house and have an apartment. He's 18, that makes sense. And the second was to buy a car. And he had a very specific old style Mustang that he had in mind. And he had been working two jobs to work towards that goal. He was working at a Marshall's and a grocery store, janitorial work, sweeping the floors, stocking, doing those jobs that we tend to put people with disabilities into. Food and filth is what we generally call them. And he was told by his parents, by his vocational rehabilitation specialist, by the community around him, that this was the best he had. This was what life was going to look like. And if he wanted to move out and get that car, working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs was the way that it was going to be for him. What he really wanted to do was also work for PepsiCo. And he wanted to be in customer service. Again, when we're talking about barriers and stereotypes and biases, our brains kind of immediately go, yeah, it's call center work, probably not a good spot for him. And so we worked through kind of his strengths, his weaknesses, his opportunities, and realized he's very capable of doing this job. However, he's failing at the interview. And so what we needed to do was get him in front of a hiring manager that was ready to understand how to identify his value, even though she did not connect with him on a personal or emotional level. And that first interview with that trained manager still went quite poorly because he wasn't quite ready. And so then we went back through and we taught him the STAR method of interviewing, which you all are probably all super familiar with. And once we gave him a pattern and we gave him a recipe, that interview changed dramatically and he got that job. And the amazing thing was, and I lost track of him after the pandemic, but for at least the next 5 years, he was in that job. He was extremely successful because the way that he speaks is very direct, which is great when you're on the phone. You don't need a lot of filler chatter. He was tenacious. As soon as that puzzle got in front of him, he was going to complete that puzzle for that customer on the other end of the line. And he then moved out of his house, got an apartment, saw his Facebook header was that car that he wanted. He bought that car, he got out of the house. His life changed dramatically because we were able to put both system and people in place to get him to work. And even as a person who lives with multiple disabilities, who works and lives in this community every day, I even had my own biases about what could happen, what he was being capable of. And what I found for myself is that I was perpetuating the cycle of low expectations for him. And so often for people with disabilities, with cognitive disabilities, who are neurodiverse, who live with developmental disabilities, we continuously set the bar of low expectations about what they can do in our workplace, about what they can do in their grown lives. And really, I think that is born out of a place of goodness, of protectionism, of making sure that we don't set people up to fail, but it's cyclical. And now we have a generation of young people who are coming through the system who have different expectations, who don't have low expectations of themselves. They've been in integrated classrooms their entire education. They are very comfortable with who they are. And they're very comfortable a lot of times talking about some of the disabilities that they have and some of the struggles that they have. And it's our job to figure out, how do we find talent that's going to work for us and that we're going to work for them, and get excited about our victories and not give up when we have those defeats, because they're going to happen. So I just really wanted to share those to open, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Bill, however he wants to handle questions or just open discussion. But hopefully that kind of sets a tone for us today. For me, there is no question that you can ask me that will offend me, hurt my feelings, or probably that I haven't heard before. This is a very open forum for me, and I'm happy to take any of your questions just as they are.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I think sets a really good stage for what I hope can be a good engaging discussion. Got some great feedback in the chat, and some people really resonating with the story you told, Julie. And I definitely did on a couple fronts. And you nailed exactly what led me to kind of this topic to begin with, is how to conduct a successful interview. And maybe that's a good place to start. So I'm curious, as we're talking as a group, if anyone's willing to share how their organization that they're part of has worked towards or has identified and started to put a plan in place to how to make this a more uh, available source of understanding for hiring managers and for interviewers. And so I'm curious if anyone wants to jump in and how they've approached it.
You guys aren't shy, are you? Come on.
No. Great question from Chase. Chase just asked, I just saw that. What would you recommend in trying to set up an inclusive interview strategy for the neurodiverse community?
That's a really great question, Jason. I appreciate you jumping in and asking the first one. So the first thing that we recommend is creating a universally designed hiring process. And so what that means from an interview perspective is that you have whatever environment that interview is happening in is built as inclusively as possible. So if you've never heard the term universal design, really what that means is creating both a physical and a technology-based environment that creates the most functional environment for as many people as possible without those people having to ask for an accommodation or a change in that environment. And so that's really the first piece, making sure that your environment and your tech work when you're doing that interview. So that can mean comfortable spaces. It can mean lack of noise. So quiet interview rooms where we don't have our backs to the door, where we're allowed some time to decompress before the interview starts. One really important, probably one, especially if this is incredibly true for me, there's always a lot of noise happening in my head. You can ask my husband, and much like Bill talked about his daughter, if my hands aren't busy, it's a rough time. But we call it embracing the power of silence. And so when you're asking an interview question, you would never know that I am neurodiverse or that I have a mental health disability. And you ask a question and you're thinking about 50 other things. You're just ready to get on to the next part of your day. You've got to do this interview. It is what it is. We've all been there. But taking the time to just ask that question and then allow a little bit of silence, 15, 20 seconds, will dramatically improve a person who's neurodiverse's ability to give you the answer that is in their head. And what happens if you maybe repeat the question, because I haven't answered yet, because I'm still processing, is my process starts over. And then my anxiety kicks in. And so what's happening is you want me to respond. You think you're being helpful. Maybe she didn't hear the question. Maybe I didn't ask it clearly enough. Maybe she's nervous and she's just zoned out. No, she's not zoned out. She's here, but the brain is functioning and working in a way that's different than how a lot of people's do. And so that's really the first piece is how do we create a universally designed space that sets up an environment that is peaceful, that is quiet, that allows a person to be in the environment where they're going to be most successful. The second, and Maria, I see your question and I kind of jumped on it, but I wanted to say, you asked, how do you know if a candidate that you're interviewing is neurodivergent? And the answer is you're likely not going to. And so what you want to do if you are a hiring manager or you have recruiters and hiring teams that are doing interviews all day, every day, is you want to provide them with a basic infrastructure of this is what hiring or interviewing a person with different types of processing and learning actually looks like. And so that they are integrating those into best practice. And it doesn't matter if a person is neurodiverse. It doesn't matter if a person has a processing disability. Your interviewers and your hiring managers are trained to allow for some of those best practices, like allowing for silence. However, I will say then just a little bit differently is there are some tells that you may see, and Bill talked about a few of them. I talked about a couple of them. And a lot of times it's going to be processing time. So how long does it take a person to process and answer back? How are they able to process your response? So are you using clear and concise language that is reflective of the level of position that you're hiring for? So if we've ever looked at a job description, which we all probably have and have written many times, most of the time those are written at a master's level because we are all educated people who write job descriptions, right? We want to bring that reading level down in our interviews as well to make sure that it is reflective of the position that we're talking about. The other thing that you can do that's really great for people who have intellectual disabilities, cognitive processing disabilities, are neurodiverse is understanding that we often learn differently. And so I had some really great managers as I was coming up through the ranks to become the executive director who happened to be trained in how people learn. And they were able to show me some techniques and habits that I had put into place and some that I needed to change to help me process information in a more uniform way that worked with my brain. And so from an interview perspective, how can you think about that? A lot of times it can be a visual interview. So this is the job that we're doing. This is what it looks like in action. Would you like to try stacking these pallets? Would you like to try answering these, candidate or these customer service example calls? Those kind of things that actually give a person who's neurodiverse a better idea of what the job is actually like will help them to make better decisions in the interview process about whether this is a good job for them or not. And what's really good about that is not only do you prepare them for what a day in the life actually looks like, you give them a chance to test that out, but then you also, if someone's not right for that job, you give them that opportunity to self-select out. And that will happen too. And that's a victory. That way you haven't hired a person that's not right for that job, because you want to make sure you're getting someone who's neurodiverse in the door. You want to make sure that you're being as inclusively or as inclusive in your hiring processes as possible. So there are a lot of different ways to look at it, and it depends on, you know, what industry you come from, what level of individual you're interviewing with. But there are some basic standards that you can put in place that are going to support anyone who's coming in through an interview for you, that is especially going to help people who process differently.
That's super helpful. I had a question that I was going to ask, and it went right back out of my mind as I was listening to you. But is there a way you can create? I think it was a little bit tied to Maria's question. And how do you know if a candidate that you're interviewing is neurodiverse, right? Which is a great question. But I think the other side of that always is interesting to me is how do you set the stage for that person to feel comfortable to be able to share with you that they are neurodivergent, right? Because to me, that's half the battle. And I will tell you, in a different sense, I have friends who are military veterans that stopped putting that on resumes because of the way they were treated. And it set them down a different path and chased the reasons because they were attorneys, and prestigious law firms saw them as probably really good banging hammers, but not really good with the law. And they were incredibly smart people, but because they put down they were a military veteran, it set a view of them. And that happens independent of what you put down, right? It triggers subconscious thinking. But we want to push that aside and evolve beyond that and be able to welcome that opportunity to have that discussion. So how do companies, are there companies that do it, and how are they doing it?
Yes. So I think the first thing that you want to do is, again, train your hiring managers to recognize what I call the yeah, but. And the yeah, but is our bias. And so if I have a bias about veterans, if I have a bias about women, if I have a bias about people who are blind, that is going to affect how I interact with them, how I think about what they bring to the table, and how I'm going to have them be a part of our organization. And we can't remove bias from our brains. We are humans. We are fouled. We are flawed, and it is just the reality of it. But what we can do is recognize our yeah buts. And so when you think about a person who's neurodiverse, you go, okay, we could hire people who are neurodiverse, but you know, maybe they're going to flake out all the time, or maybe, you know, they won't show up, or what if they're dangerous? Like, you start going through those yeah buts in your brain. And when you can hear that and not just recognize that this is just my normal thought pattern, recognize that those are your biases, that's the first action that you can take as a human. But it's also what we want to help our hiring managers and our people leaders understand. It's okay to have bias. You do have bias because your experience with people with disabilities is limited to your experience with people with disabilities or what you see on television or in movies. And then to recognize that bias and start to defeat it. And so we like to do a training that's called Removing Fear and Stigma. And it is just as simple as that. It is, here's a person who has this type of disability. What are some of the commonalities of that type of disability? How are some of what are some of the common biases? And what are some best practices that you should do to help make sure that they are successful in whatever environment that you're putting them in? That's really important. And you need to close the door and allow your hiring managers and your people leaders to ask whatever questions that they need to ask. Because the other thing that we do with disability and mental illness and neurodiversity are, I think, especially burdened by the fact that we just are scared to talk about it. We're scared to say the wrong thing. We're scared of putting our companies at risk. We're scared of putting our jobs at risk. And we need to be able to talk about things. We need to be able to ask really stupid questions if that's what we need to do. And that's okay. And have a place that can happen. And that's really just the first step in kind of setting a culture that's going to be more inclusive. The other thing is we want you to start thinking about your employer brand as it's related to our community. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit more broadly than neurodiversity to just the disability community in general, and then kind of to drive it back down is if you go out to your employer page today, and I would challenge each one of you to do it, and wherever diversity and inclusion, maybe disabilities under there, maybe it's under accommodations, maybe it doesn't exist at all, maybe it has its own page. That's kind of the first thing you want to look at. The second is what am I saying? What is my company saying to our community? And what you'll find very often is, let's say a Black employee celebration that we're having on our employer brand page that talks about the fantastic Black woman who just got promoted to VP, the activities that we did to, advance Black development within our management team, the number of individuals that we've brought into the workforce, and the activities that we did that contributed back to our community for Black employees. And then you look at the disability page and you'll oftentimes see a couple of things. One is it doesn't exist. Two, it says, hey, if you need an accommodation, you could call us or you can email us. And I can promise you after 15 years of or 13 years of tests, that line almost never gets answered and that email almost never gets returned. And then the third thing is, you've got the page, awesome. Or you've got some part of the story that's telling how people with disabilities should perceive your brand. And you talk about this really amazing work that your ERG or your PBRG did to support Special Olympics. And that's it. And that's the fundamental difference is when we talk to what we do with the disability community, when we're doing our talent attraction strategy, it is generally speaking almost exclusively focused on fear or pity. And so if you want me, someone who has 15 years of professional experience, who has hidden disabilities, who is an executive and a co-founder of a business who has tons and tons of experience, how do you get me to pick you? And how do you get me to be comfortable in an interview or in whatever facet that I'm engaged with your organization to say, hey, yeah, I live with disabilities. I'm neurodiverse. I have mental illness. It's not by only talking about charity, and it's not by talking about the community in general as there's a tendency to infantilize people with disabilities, which means we treat them as children, no matter their status as adults, as professionals, because of that protectionism. And I think a lot of times because in companies, parents are doing the speaking for us as caregivers. And so what we want to think about is what stories can you tell that make me want to pick you? And how is the way that you've approached that, if you have so far, different or less talent focused potentially than what you've done for other underrepresented communities? And why would the largest underrepresented community in the world and in America outside of women be treated differently because the bias drives the value proposition that you're putting back out to us? And so that's really, really important. And I may have strayed off topic a little bit. This is one of my soapbox issues, I guess, is we want you to talk to us competitively. We want you to talk to us because we have choices of other employers to pick. And if you think that we don't, you're wrong. And the other really cool thing about your brand that I think is so different and important in a post-pandemic world is that we have 2 million additional job seekers who've entered the labor force since the pandemic has ended. And that's because we had a world where people who generally could not go to work were successful at work and were able to work. And we also have the highest labor force participation rate for people with disabilities since the BLS started collecting that data. And finally, the number of people with neurodiverse disabilities is only expected to continue to rise. Right now, the live births, 1 in 39 are people, babies with autism. That number is expected to increase. And so we're going to see more people with autism. We're going to see, again, a generation that's very accustomed to being neurodiverse and very comfortable with it. And when we talk about talent, it's going to be more than just charity that they want to talk about. They want to see what's in it for them.
Awesome. That is a great way to summarize that. I like that. That kind of helps me put framing around it that sometimes is challenging. And the one thing that really resonated with me as a person was the lack of understanding. And I will say that I did not understand at a point in my life and had a stereotype in my mind on people on the spectrum and autism. Not maliciously, but just because I didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. And I've taken the time to read a number of books and talk and understand. And today it's a very different perspective. But I can imagine that had I not gone through that process, I wouldn't have the perspective I do today. And Chase asked a great question around what advice when a candidate asks a question. What is your advice on when to ask a candidate? Do they need any accommodations? And should these questions be asked during the interview process? And if so, what's the proper question?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And
Before you answer it,
yeah,
I just want to say a long time ago, I sat through some training about a gentleman who went on 28 interviews in Manhattan. And it took him, I think, 3 hours just to tie his tie because of his disabilities. He was in a wheelchair. But his win that he shared with me that just has resonated in my mind since is not, do you need any accommodations? It's, what do you need to be successful? And I found that change of perspective such a refreshing way to think about it, because at the end of the day, he needed to be on the first floor of the building and he needed a step stool for the bathroom and the copier. That was it. That's all he needed. That's what made him successful. And so I think that for me always had stuck in my brain, like, God, that's such a better way to think. So sorry, I just want to share that.
Well, and you're 100% right. And you're doing a lot about what I just talked about with branding is you take something that is legal and scary and you make it accessible and engaging. And when we talk about, do you need an accommodation? If we stick with the interview process, to your point, Chase, is the best time to ask, do you need an accommodation, is before the interview itself. And the reason that one of the most kind of frustrating things, and one of the things I talk to young grads about is that if you need an accommodation for an interview, you need to be upfront about it. And that's a scary thing. And it's not always an easy thing to ask, but I've also had experiences, and I'm sure some of you have as well, where someone needed an interpreter and they showed up and expected an interpreter to be there, but there certainly wasn't because the company didn't know that was a need. And so there's some work that we have to do in our own community about self-help and self-support and really being our best self-advocates. But for you guys, what can you do? The best thing to do is, hey, we're scheduling an interview. Do you need any accommodations to be successful in the interview? Easy peasy, right? And you don't necessarily want to ask that question in the interview, because that will make people less comfortable and maybe drive some nerves. There may be some legalese around that too. I'm not a lawyer, but what we do want to do is try to have that ready before we get to that place. And also what that does is it helps the manager who's going to be doing that interview to also be prepared. Because the last thing they want to do is show up at an interview where someone needs an interpreter or who someone needs an accommodation and then be unaware. Then everyone is nervous. Everybody's uncomfortable. No one is set up for success. And so we're doing a disservice, not just to the candidate and our brand, but we're doing a disservice to the people that already work for us as well by setting them up to fail when they could have a perfectly great candidate right in front of them and everything is thrown off because we don't have that basic accommodation and process. And guys, it's not going to be perfect. I think that's the other thing about accommodations, disability, DEI in general, is that you shouldn't expect yourselves to do it perfectly. And there are always going to be situations where we mess up. And as long as we can say, hey, kind of messed this up, let me try again. That's going to buy you more goodwill in the community than nearly anything else that you will do. Is just that honesty and that transparency. Hey, you know what? I've never interviewed a person who is blind before. I'm going to ask some questions, but if there's something that you need me to do that makes this work better for you, just tell me. Like, I'm totally open to it. And just having human conversations like that will go a long way. But ideally, just base case scenario is you want to know that someone needs an accommodation and have the ability to prep for that before they actually arrive on the door in the door. That's a great question, Chase. Thank you.
Yeah, very cool. So we've shared a lot of information and answered some questions. I'm curious, have we talked about something that has made you think that there might be something better or some ways that you could bring some of this conversation back into your environment? We all work in different companies. Each company has its own culture and process. But for me, I'm always one of those people who loves to listen and see if there's something I can glean from any professional experience or personal experience that I can use to make things better. So I'm curious, is there anything that we've been talking about so far that is helping you rethink maybe how you might do things within your company?
Hi, this is Autumn, and I work for a company called Cohere Health. We don't necessarily have kind of a policy or a stance right now, so I'm just curious, how do you almost build this from the ground up into your interview process? What do you think is the first step to take?
So I'm just a big proponent of building a business case for everything. And so I would start with, what are our interview success rates now? Depending on how, again, I don't know your business, but how do you do interviews? What are you hiring for? What's turnover look like? And then you have that base case, and you want to start to look for best practices, solutions, whether it goes in your tech stack or it's training, or an interview guide about how we want to implement this. And then when you do that, what you want to look at is, if we're creating a universally designed interview process, then what's the output of that? What is the outcome of that? And if we start to see improvements, then those are things that you can take back to the boss and say, hey, investing in the community, which really is for the neurodiversity community, has actually helped all of our interviews go better. We're starting to see some things change around acceptance rates, first 90 days of employment, those types of things. And that, it's kind of, I don't want it to be too generic of an answer. I think the thing that I want to most reinforce is that whatever you put in place should have some measures, and it should have some KPIs so that you know, and you can show someone who's above you that this is worth continuing to do. Because what happens a lot of times is we start down this road and budgets get tight, or DEI goes out of style, and then we stop doing it. But the goal here is, with anything that you do, is to start with something that can be scaled to an enterprise level, and that is good for the entirety of the business, not just a community that's being approached as philanthropic. And so, as opposed to maybe a policy, I would look at process and what you can see in your process and how your candidates are moving through your apply process, your interview process. I think will give you some idea about where we could best stand up some tech or some best practices to help people move through the system more properly. And if I didn't answer your question, just tell me I didn't, and I'll try again.
No, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's super helpful. So for everyone else, just curious, I'd love to hear some examples of how different companies are approaching this, and you can share with whatever level of candor you can. But I'm really curious is how other, like we definitely shared and talk about some best practices, but I'd really love to learn how other companies are doing it and have addressed or have thought about this issue.
Hi, my name is Sandra, and I am in higher ed right now, recruiting for Cal Poly Pomona here in California. Something that we are starting to implement is preparing questions ahead of time to our candidates. That way they're well prepared for those with anxiety or anything that, because a lot of times our hiring managers are coming back to us saying they have a great resume, they have great experience, but they interviewed poorly. And that could be external factors. And we want to make sure everyone is well equipped and doing their best during these interviews.
And I think that's a great example of how to help everyone be more successful. And that is certainly for me, I can speak, that would help me dramatically. And Sandra, you would be surprised how often I hear that if we allow people to know the interview questions before, if we give them the time to re-record an answer, then that makes it not genuine, or that makes it, it may not be the right answer. It may not truly be what they can do. And it's so counterintuitive to me that we would not set people up for success. And that's really a fantastic example of how you're doing that to not just meet people who have disabilities needs, but also others as well.
Awesome. Couple Padma in chat asked if there are any resources you would suggest to educate our employees on what neurodiversity is.
Trying to think of some easy ones, and I'm going to say not off the top of my head, but I'll make a commitment that I will send a few over to Bill when we're done, and he can share them with the group if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Mary Lou, I appreciate your feedback as well, that there's no training for hiring managers to understand what neurodiversity is. And yes, I'm sure that I will connect you and Julie after, because yes, I'm sure she would be happy to speak to your company about this.
Yes, yeah, and there are some best practices around neurodiversity. I think not just myself, but there are a number of outstanding speakers and trainers on the circuit. There are also some out-of-the-box sort of web-based trainings that I think help reinforce ideas as well. So the other thing about this type of training or engagement is it has to be ongoing. And it has to be, we like to give people things in snackable type portions so that they can start to integrate and develop and then move on to the next piece of training. And so as you kind of think about it as an overall strategy, it's probably a multi-pronged kind of approach to really see the change that you want to.
Awesome. So one of the things, so when I look at issues like this, they're big, they're complex, and there's a lot of ways that we can tackle them. And sometimes that prevents action from being taken because they are big and complex. But what are some of the things that we can do today or tomorrow that would enable us just to exhibit the right behavior that we want everyone else in our organization to exhibit? And so for me, as a parent, I've changed language, I've changed tone and tenor, and I've changed approach. And that's helped me tremendously. And they're small changes, but it's created much bigger impact. And so as we think about that in a corporate structure, what are some of the little things that we as individuals can do to be better in this area?
So I think you talked about the big ones, right? It's living the behavior that we expect and want to model for those who are on our teams or who are around us. I also think that there is a lot of times where we can get into analysis paralysis because it feels like such a big opportunity, and it feels like if I mess this up, we've ruined ourselves with the community. We've made ourselves look silly. And I think that it's important to just know that the first step is the hardest, and you will absolutely not be perfect. But the most impactful thing you could do right now, period, out of the gate, is that anytime you're putting a human resource, TA, operational strategy in place, that you don't think about people who are neurodiverse, people who are disabled after you've built that strategy, after you've picked that tech, after you've put those data management techniques in place, but you've done it proactively. We are very much the comma and those other people that we just thought of right now because we got in trouble with the OFCCP or something like that kind of group. And the most encouraging thing that you can do, or the best thing you can do, is to encourage that every plan includes us from the beginning. And that will take care of so many of these fears about how to tackle it. And then we want you to learn about how to best engage in the community. There are really funny comedies on television and actors and individuals who are neurodiverse, who live on the spectrum, who, every day kind of exist. There's no lack of content to hear what's inside of our head. And it's not always pretty, I will tell you that quite honestly, but it normalizes what you see and what you hear. I would encourage you, oh my gosh, it just went out of my head. There's a fantastic documentary, and I will send it to Bill as well because it's just left my brain, on Netflix, about how the disability rights movement started at it's called Crip Camp, at a camp in upstate New York for disabled children, who became some of the bright and shining leaders within our civil rights movement that marched and wheeled alongside Dr. King and others to make sure that we got to the ADA, that we got IDEA, all of those things. And so I would also encourage you to spend a little time in our history. Learn more about our community and how we've really come into our own over the last almost 10 years now, and you're starting to see a much larger use of our voice. And there again is no lack of finding people who are willing to talk about themselves, whether it's on a mic or on a documentary or any other thing.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we have 4 minutes left, so wanted to just put it out there. Athena made a great comment that she was here to learn, as they're not explicitly doing anything. So hopefully, Athena, we helped accomplish that goal. And I just wanted to open the forum up for, is there anyone out there that has a burning question or would like to ask one more question while we have Julie's time? Awesome. Well, Julie, why don't you just take a moment and share with everyone kind of a little bit about Disability Solutions, if this is a platform that can help in this area. And then we'll wrap it up. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. These were fantastic questions. Chase, I appreciate you sharing Udemy and Blue Ocean Brain. I think that's fantastic. I don't know Blue Ocean Brain, so I myself will go check that out. So Disability Solutions, we are a probably the largest, most expansive disability and inclusion TA company in the world. We work with about 80 plus companies right now. And really our goal is to change minds and change lives, just like I talked about at the beginning, which means that we work with companies where they are. We know that some of you are just dipping your toe in, and maybe it's just advertising and outreach that you're ready to do right now. That's okay. That's a great place to start. Maybe you want to work on brand, training, accessibility. Really, if it's end-to-end talent acquisition, we're able to support you in that. Some of our bigger kind of consulting-based work, like what we do still now, even 13 years with Pepsi every year, is really that we help them with the brand. We help make sure that an equitable pipeline is coming through within their systems. We're making sure that people are getting hired. And then we're measuring that QA, QC on the back to make sure that people with disabilities are staying at least as long in role as a general hire. We work with about 19,000 community-based contacts throughout the world to help make sure that we're getting to the freshest source of job seekers that are out there. And we're helping to build your brand and your credibility within the community, because we've spent 13 years making sure that our community knows we're focused on getting them back to work. So if you're interested in any of that, or if you're not, I'm still happy to connect. You can learn more about us at disabilitytalent.org. If you go to any social media on the planet, my name is Julie Sowash, Sowash, Sowash and so clean. And you can find me there, and I'd be happy to chat with you guys anytime.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Well, we are about a minute away from closing, so I will thank the one other thing, like I love these discussions. And the goal of these forums is a safe environment for us to discuss meaningful topics. If you have a meaningful topic that you would like us to discuss, all you have to do is reach out to me via email or within the chat function within the Talk platform. Send them to me, because these are the discussions I want to have. They're relevant, they're important, and it allows us to exchange ideas. It makes us all do things better. So with that, I'm going to close up. I really appreciate it, everybody. Thank you for coming. And I had a great time today. Thanks for everyone's participation.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Bye.